I love the colour of Eavy Metal orc skin, but it can take a while to pull off. You can speed it up with one small change and keep the standard high with a few optional stages. Now the colour range in Eavy Metal orc skin has great depth to it, and a majority of the work is done in the shading, with soft and deep recess shading. These shade passes give the effect of extra highlights that aren't really there. I think it's a touch heavy in areas, so I won't be adding as much, and this also means that I'll be getting the model done even quicker by skipping them. Here's a full list of paints I'll be using. Some are optional, say if you wanted to give a character or boss a little extra attention, that's where you would use them, and I'll point them out as and when I'm using them. I've chosen to start with a grey base coat, as I wanted to show the whole process of painting without an airbrush. I've also chosen grey as it's brighter than black and won't take many coats to get decent coverage with this green. And it's not as bright as white, meaning I won't have to struggle getting my shadows back in those hard to reach areas. I'm going to be using the standard mix for Eavy Metal orc skin, which is roughly 50-50 equal parts Averland Sunset and Skarsnik green. If you wanted a pre-mixed tone, the closest ones I have to hand would be either Elysian green from Games Workshop or Golden Olive from AK. When laying down this base coat, I'm using a large damp brush, keeping the paint moving using the wet edge of the paint as to prevent paint tearing as it dries halfway. This is the longest stage of the whole painting process, so if you have an airbrush, you can save a whole lot of time at this stage by just laying down a nice solid base coat with the airbrush. I prefer not dealing with overspray in hard to reach areas, so I'm happy doing this stage with a brush. I prefer the Warhammer paints for this skin as I feel it applies better with the brush. I may have less coverage than the AK, but it doesn't have the tendency to leave texture like the AK does from my personal experience. Here is the first optional step. I'm taking the base mix and adding equal parts Kislev flesh to it. I'm doing this to make the transitions to pure Kislev a bit smoother. This makes sense for characters and such. I'm not great at glazing, so I'll be adding just a little bit of glaze medium to keep the paint depositing evenly. If you don't have glaze medium, any standard medium would work like Lamium. Thinning just with water, I find the pigment can pull much easier, but it always pulls at the end of my brushstroke too. With glaze medium, the pigment is suspended much better and you get an even glaze or distribution of pigment this way. I'm applying this to the lips, ears, nose, veins, knuckles, elbows and tips of the fingers. You can cut these areas down to save a lot of time, and in my opinion, the most important areas to put this Kislev down is located on the face, particularly the lips. Now that's done, it's time for pure Kislev flesh. I'm putting this simply within the previous areas. If you skip the previous stage, I'll just make sure to thin this Kislev down just a little bit so you get somewhat of a decent transition going. Now it's time for the magic step. It's contrast paint, who would have guessed? I'm using Warp Lightning, but adding it to the base mix and thinning with contrast medium to keep the contrast properties. I'm mixing roughly 50-50 Warp Lightning and the base tone. Once I've got it thinned down with the contrast paint, I'm just going to add a touch of water to get the fluidity I want. Now, why am I doing this? As I said at the beginning of the video, the shading in Eavy Metal recipes has a lot of value, particularly in cloth and skin. It brings a ton of depth in tone and value, light and dark, thus making your original mid-tone of a base coat look like it's been highlighted and has more stages to it than it actually does. Traditionally, these shades would be completed through careful glazing, and this takes ages. I've done it before. But with the contrast paint, I'm now loading up the brush and washing areas of the skin, wicking off the brush and quickly taking away pigment from the raised surfaces. If I need to remove large areas, I'll be using pure contrast medium as an eraser. Using a damp brush to remove paint will cause the remaining contrast paint to dry much quicker. Adding more medium or paint to the surface will extend this working time. Be careful not adding too much medium, as this is still paint at the end of the day and excess pooling of this stuff will obscure detail. And again, like the point I made about glaze medium, the pigment will be suspended very evenly in the contrast paint, as there's very little water. So what does this mean? It means that the wash pass is going to stain the whole surface of this skin quite drastically if we don't manipulate it like I've been doing. We need to make sure to pull away a fair amount from the raised surfaces so the skin doesn't look too green. Ideally, we want this pigment to settle softly in the recesses and do the blending for us. These washes always tend to dry much quicker than you'd think, so I suggest working in small sections like the chest, the stomach and the face. But do not try to split the arm, for example, into sections. There's no real seams to work with, so if you do one section of the arm, let it dry, you're going to have bad tea staining and an obvious seam in where you've been doing this wash. If you feel your wash wasn't dark enough in just one pass, you can add select areas with standard glazing or just repeat the previous stage. I messed up the sword arm a little bit with that wash stage, and I didn't take away enough pigment, but that's no issues really because we can just clean up using our base tone. I'm simply just taking the base mix, adding a touch of glazed medium, and I'm pulling that pigment towards where the natural highlight point would be. If you get confused where the natural highlight point would be, you can either look at the box art or just pull the pigment to the upper center portions of each muscle group. The good thing about the previous cleanup stage, is that it will build some muscle memory for where we put our next highlights. To begin highlighting the skin, I'm going to be taking the base tone, again with a little glazed medium, and I'm adding a brush load of light earth. This highlight stage shouldn't be that big in terms of a brightness jump. I've thinned mine a fair bit to make the transition smooth, but you could easily not thin as much and make this your final highlight stage for the skin. Just adding the eyes, teeth and nails and be done. On camera it looks like I'm painting pretty much nothing, but trust me, there is a highlight there in person. Now that's done, I'm just going to clean up the areas of Kislev. With the wash stage, certain areas of the Kislev that we established before have been covered up, and this is going to be most noticeable on the knuckles and the lips. So I'm just coming back with pure Kislev and I'm pushing that tone back in. I'm adding a Steggadon scale green to the palette now, and I'm mixing it again with the base tone and a little bit of glazed medium. I'm doing this for some deep recessed shades in the ears and eyes. You see on Eavy Metal skin, they tend to have kind of discoloration or shadowing around the eyes and ears. This is an optional step if you want to add a bit more character and life to the skin. Here I went a bit heavy on the eyes. I should have thinned it a bit more and done it over 2 layers, but we can easily come back in with a little thin down wash just to soften the edge, and then come back in with the base tone mix if you want to soften out even more. Once the previous step is nice and dry, I'm coming in and base coating the eyes with just Khorne Red. Make sure you cover the whole surface of the eyes with Khorne Red to give the highlight stage enough space to really pop. Whilst I've got the Khorne Red on the palette, I'm thinning it down with some glazed medium and a lot of water, as it's quite a strong colour in comparison to the green flesh. And I'm just adding some nice subtle glazes under the lips, inside the ear, and I'm just tinting the surface of the elbows. The main area is under the lip, and again this is an optional stage that you only really need for some characters to bring more life to this skin. I'm adding Screaming Skull to the palette now, and I'm going to start off by base coating the teeth. With the use of some washes, I'm going to be using Agrax. We can paint the teeth with just one paint. It may take a few layers, but it's easier in my opinion to just use the one paint and one wash compared to 3 paints and a wash. Once they're base coated, I'm applying a fairly heavy wash of Agrax. I'm applying the wash at the tips of the teeth and I'm pulling them down to the base of the teeth so I can get an even nice coverage and getting select pooling around the recessed detail, and I'm making the elements pop away from the lips and really drawing you into the face. Whilst the wash is drying, I'm going to be highlighting the eyes with Wild Rider Red. I'm just applying a single dot to each eye, creating a simple striking evil eye. Applying the heavier wash of Agrax has stained the flat surface a bit more, darkening the teeth enough to have some fresh, pure Screaming Skull appear as a highlight. With these highlights, I'm just focusing on the tips to get the most out of each tooth. Adding a bit of Screaming Skull to Kislev flesh, I'm highlighting the fronts of the lips and lower edges of the nostrils. A personal touch, I like highlighting the recessed ridges of the space between the upper lip and the nose. I feel it brings a bit more of an organic feeling to the skin. To highlight the nails, I'm just adding Screaming Skull to Steggadon Green in 2 stages of highlight. If you want to push it further, you can add an extra highlight, but it's quite unnecessary for rank and file. Now for our final level of highlight, an optional stage is to add a second highlight to the green skin by taking our previous mix and just adding a touch of Screaming Skull. For the final stage of highlight, I'm focusing on the key focal areas for this model. It's going to be the face, which then bleeds out to the top of the chest and the shoulder on the gun arm. It's always worth your while adding a little more highlight to the hands as well, as we like looking at the weapons. This second stage of highlight is all about bringing a bit more attention to the green skin, whereas previously we're ticking the boxes and saying, yeah, this is just orc skin, but now we're bringing attention to the muscle volumes, the expression of the face, and in general just bringing a bit more wow factor and readability to the forms. And for the most part, I'm just putting highlights within our previous sections that we covered in the first highlight, just covering a smaller area. One thing to keep in mind if you are considering doing this final highlight is that it should take half the time of the previous highlight, because we're covering a smaller area that has already been covered. And just a couple extra minutes of work can really boost the overall effect of this skin, bringing in a ton of value. We haven't quite got to the stage of diminishing returns. Now this video covers the basics for this orc skin, which I would consider to be tabletop and above. But if you would like to see how I take this skin to the next level, approaching display or competition level, as well as how I painted the rest of the model, then please consider checking out the Phoenix Miniature Art Patreon. We have tons of in-depth tutorials and a fleshed out fundamentals of painting series. Cheers, and I'll see you in the next video.